The interstate stretched endlessly through the Nevada desert, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the stars themselves. Sophia pressed her forehead against the passenger window of the rusted pickup truck, watching her breath fog the glass in shallow, trembling clouds. 16 years old, and she had learned to make herself small, to fold inward like origami, hoping that invisibility might equal safety. Her stepfather's hands gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, his jaw working rhythmically as he chewed tobacco and spat into a stained coffee cup wedged between his thighs. The night air carried the sharp bite of October cold, and Sophia pulled her thin jacket tighter around her frame. She had been slight even before the hunger started. Before her mother's death 6 months ago had left her alone with a man whose eyes had grown darker with each passing week. The backpack at her feet contained everything she owned: 3 changes of clothes, a photograph of her mother, and $47 she had hidden in the lining. She didn't know where they were going, only that her stepfather had promised it would solve their money problems. The way he had said it, with that particular edge to his voice, had made her stomach turn to ice. The rusty chain appeared like a mirage in the emptiness, a sprawling collection of motorcycles, pickup trucks, and harsh fluorescent lights spilling from Grimsley windows. Music pounded from inside, a bass-heavy throb that seemed to make the very ground vibrate. Men clustered outside, leather-clad figures with beards and tattoos, smoke curling from cigarettes as they laughed with voices roughened by whiskey and violence. Sophia's stepfather pulled into the gravel lot, and the sound of tires crunching stone felt like a countdown to something terrible. He killed the engine and sat for a moment, staring straight ahead. Sophia could smell the sour reek of alcohol on his breath, could see the nervous tremor in his fingers as he reached for the door handle. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, scraped clean of whatever humanity might have once resided there. He told her to come inside, to stay close, to keep her mouth shut. He told her they were meeting some friends. He told her everything would be fine. Every word was a lie, and they both knew it. Into the wolves' den. The interior of the rusty chain assaulted Sophia's senses with overwhelming force. Cigarette smoke hung thick in the air, creating halos around the dim overhead lights. The floor was sticky beneath her worn sneakers, decades of spilled beer creating a patina of filth that no amount of mopping could remedy. Pool balls cracked against each other in the corner, while a jukebox blared classic rock so loud it seemed to compress the air itself. Men turned to look as she entered, their gazes crawling over her like insects, assessing, calculating, stripping away what little armor she had left. Her stepfather's hand clamped onto her shoulder with bruising force, steering her through the crowd toward a table near the back. 3 men sat there, their leather cuts displaying patches that marked them as officers in the Desert Snakes, a biker gang whose reputation for violence and drug trafficking had made them legends in the worst possible way. The president, a mountain of a man called Bear, had arms thick as tree trunks and a beard that hung to his chest. His eyes, small and mean, fixed on Sophia with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The negotiation happened in voices too low for her to hear clearly, but she caught fragments, words like clean, untouched, good investment. Her stepfather's hands shook as he accepted a wad of cash, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed repeatedly. Sophia felt the world tilting, reality fracturing into something nightmarish and surreal. This couldn't be happening. This was America, the 21st century, a country with laws and protection. But in this forgotten corner of Nevada, in this den of criminals and predators, laws meant nothing. When understanding finally crystallized in her mind, when she truly comprehended that her stepfather had brought her here to sell her, to trade her body for cash that would probably disappear into a casino or liquor store within hours, something inside her broke. Not her spirit, but rather the paralysis that fear had imposed. Survival instinct, that ancient animal wisdom that lives in the brainstem, suddenly screamed at her to run, and so she did. The chase Sophia bolted without conscious thought, her legs carrying her toward the front door with desperate speed. Behind her, chairs scraped against the floor and voices rose in surprise and anger. The music seemed to swell louder, or perhaps it was just the blood pounding in her ears, as she crashed through the entrance and into the parking lot. The cold night air hit her face like a slap, and she gasped it down in ragged gulps as her sneakers slapped against gravel. She didn't make it far. Hands grabbed her from behind, yanking her backward so hard she nearly fell. More hands joined the first, and suddenly she was surrounded by a circle of men whose faces twisted with amusement and cruelty. They mocked her tears, her pleas, her pathetic attempt at escape. One of them grabbed her backpack and dumped its contents onto the ground, laughing as her few possessions scattered in the dirt. Another reached for her face, and she flinched away so violently she stumbled backward into the wall of the building. The brick pressed cold and rough against her spine. She was trapped, cornered like prey by predators who saw her as nothing more than merchandise. Her stepfather emerged from the bar, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. He shouted at her about disrespect, about causing trouble, about making him look bad. The words were meaningless noise, the desperate justifications of a man who had sold his soul and was trying to convince himself he'd gotten a fair price. Through the chaos, Sophia's eyes found a figure sitting alone at the outdoor bar area, a section of the parking lot where a few high-top tables and stools sat beneath strings of lights. The man hadn't moved during the commotion, hadn't even turned his head. He sat perfectly still, a glass of amber liquid untouched before him, his attention seemingly focused on the darkness beyond the parking lot. Something about his stillness, his absolute calm amid the chaos, drew her attention like a lighthouse in a storm. Desperation drove her to do something that defied all logic. She tore away from her captors for just a moment, stumbling toward the bar, and whispered words that would change the trajectory of that entire night. She told the stranger what was happening, that her stepfather was selling her, that she needed help, that she had nowhere else to turn. Her voice cracked on the words, broken and small, the plea of someone who had exhausted every other option. The devil rises. For several heartbeats, nothing happened. The man didn't acknowledge her words, didn't move, didn't even blink. The bikers behind her laughed, already reaching to drag her back. Her stepfather's voice rose in fresh anger, demanding she stop making a scene. The night seemed poised to continue its terrible trajectory, her fate sealed by poverty and cruelty and the fundamental indifference of the universe to individual suffering. Then the man stood. It was a simple movement, unhurried and economical, but it carried such weight that conversation faltered and died. He rose from his stool with the fluid grace of someone whose body was a perfectly calibrated weapon, and the dim lights caught the planes of his face. Sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, and a scar that ran from his temple to his chin. A pale line that spoke of violence survived. His coat was black and expensive, cut in a style that suggested European tailoring, and when he turned to face the bikers, his eyes were the color of winter ice. Adrian Luciani had not come to the Rusty Chain looking for trouble. He had stopped for a drink during a long drive, seeking the anonymity that such places offered, somewhere nobody would recognize one of the most powerful Mafia bosses on the West Coast. He had been content to remain invisible, to let the chaos of other people's lives swirl around him, while he enjoyed the solitude of his own thoughts. But the girl's whispered plea had activated something in him that he usually kept locked away. A sense of justice, perhaps, or maybe just an intolerance for the particular brand of evil that exploited children. He looked at Sophia first, really looked at her, and saw everything in an instant. The terror in her eyes, the bruises on her arms, the hollowness of cheeks that spoke of too many missed meals. Then his gaze swept to the bikers surrounding her, cataloguing their positions, their weapons, their levels of intoxication. Finally, his attention settled on her stepfather, and something in his expression made the older man take an involuntary step backward. When Adrian spoke, His voice was quiet, barely audible above the music still pounding from inside the bar. He said that the men had just made a deal with the wrong devil. The words carried an authority that transcended volume, a certainty that suggested forces beyond normal human experience. The temperature in the parking lot seemed to drop several degrees, and even the most hardened bikers felt something primal stir in their guts, the recognition that they were suddenly in the presence of a superior predator. Reckoning what happened next unfolded with the terrible beauty of a choreographed dance. Bear, the gang president, made the first move, a mistake born of ego and underestimation. He reached for the knife at his belt, while simultaneously signaling two of his men to flank Adrian from either side. They were experienced fighters, men who had survived countless bar brawls and territorial disputes, men who believed that numbers and brutality would carry the day. Adrian moved like liquid shadow. He stepped inside Bear's knife thrust, his hand closing around the bigger man's wrist with crushing force. Bones snapped with an audible crack, and the knife clattered to the ground. Before Bear could even process the pain, Adrian's elbow drove into his solar plexus, expelling all air from his lungs and dropping him to his knees. The entire exchange lasted perhaps 2 seconds. The flanking bikers attacked simultaneously, one swinging a beer bottle, while the other rushed forward with outstretched hands, meant to grapple. Adrian ducked the bottle, heard it whistle past his ear, and used the attacking biker's momentum against him. A perfectly timed pivot sent the man crashing face first into the wall Sophia had been pressed against moments before. The second attacker managed to get his hands on Adrian's coat, but that proximity proved his downfall. Adrian's knee came up in a devastating strike that left the man gasping and crumpling to the asphalt. More bikers poured from the bar, drawn by the commotion. They came in a wave of leather and rage, some wielding pool cues, others brandishing chains or brass knuckles. Adrian faced them with the same eerie calm he had displayed sitting at the bar, his breathing still steady, his movements economical and precise. He didn't fight like a street brawler. There was no wasted motion, no telegraphed attacks, just pure efficiency honed by years of training that went far beyond anything these men had ever encountered. A pool cue shattered across his raised forearm, the wood splintering while his arm remained unbroken. He caught the remaining fragment and drove it into his attacker's knee, then spun to face the next threat. A chain whipped toward his face, and he caught it mid-swing, wrapping it around his hand and yanking hard enough to pull the wielder off balance. His fist met the stumbling man's jaw with a sound like a hammer striking meat, and another body hit the ground. The parking lot became a tableau of controlled chaos. Adrian moved through the crowd like a scalpel through diseased tissue, removing threats with surgical precision. He broke arms, shattered kneecaps, delivered strikes to nerve clusters that left men temporarily paralyzed and writhing on the ground. Blood sprayed across gravel, mixing with spilled beer and motor oil. The harsh fluorescent lights cast stark shadows that made the violence seem even more brutal, more final. Throughout it all, Sophia remained pressed against the wall, her hands covering her mouth to stifle screams. She had never witnessed violence like this, not the drunken stumbling of bar fights or the theatrical choreography of action movies, but real combat, executed by someone who had mastered the art of hurting people. Part of her was horrified, part of her was mesmerized, and a small, dark part of her felt a fierce satisfaction watching the men who had terrorized her receive exactly what they deserved. The aftermath. When it was over, when the last biker lay groaning on the ground or had fled into the desert darkness, Adrian stood amid the carnage with barely a hair out of place. His knuckles were split and bleeding, and there was a small tear in his expensive coat, but otherwise he seemed untouched by the battle he had just won. His breathing remained steady, his expression neutral, as if he had done nothing more strenuous than take a brief walk. Sophia's stepfather had tried to slip away during the fight, had made it halfway to his truck before Adrian's voice stopped him cold. The older man froze, his hand on the door handle, his entire body rigid with terror. Adrian crossed the parking lot with unhurried strides, each footfall deliberate and measured. When he reached the truck, he grabbed the stepfather by the collar and lifted him effortlessly, pressing him against the vehicle's side. No words were exchanged. Adrian's expression said everything that needed saying, that this man had committed an unforgivable sin, that his life was forfeit, that only mercy he hadn't earned was staying his execution. He reached into the stepfather's pocket and retrieved the blood money, the cash that represented Sophia's stolen future. Then he threw the man to the ground with such force that several ribs cracked audibly. The stepfather curled into a fetal position, sobbing and pleading, but Adrian had already turned away. He walked back to where Sophia still stood against the wall, her eyes wide and disbelieving. The strings of lights overhead swayed gently in the night breeze, casting shifting patterns across his scarred face. When he looked at her, his expression softened almost imperceptibly. Not warm exactly, but no longer the cold mask of violence he had worn moments before. He told her she was coming with him, not as a question, not as a demand, but as a simple statement of fact. Sophia should have been terrified. This man was clearly dangerous, clearly capable of extreme violence, clearly operating outside the bounds of law and normal society. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something that the bikers and her stepfather had never possessed: honor. Brutal and absolute, perhaps, but honor nonetheless. When he extended his hand to help her gather her scattered belongings, she took it without hesitation. New foundations. The drive away from the rusty chain happened in silence. Adrian drove a black Mercedes sedan that seemed impossibly clean and refined compared to the filthy pickup truck Sophia had arrived in. She sat in the passenger seat, her backpack clutched to her chest like a shield, watching the desert landscape blur past the window. Questions bubbled up inside her. Who was this man? Where were they going? What would happen to her now? But she couldn't seem to form words. Shock had settled over her like a blanket, muffling everything. They drove for 3 hours, the endless highway eventually giving way to the scattered lights of Las Vegas. But Adrian didn't stop in the city proper. Instead, he navigated through increasingly upscale neighborhoods, finally turning into a gated community where houses sat on sprawling lots behind walls and security systems. His home was impressive, but not ostentatious. A 2-story, southwestern-style structure with clean lines and large windows that suggested someone who valued both privacy and light. Inside, the house was immaculately maintained. Hardwood floors gleamed beneath Sophia's feet, and modern furniture in neutral tones created spaces that felt both comfortable and expensive. Adrian led her to a guest bedroom on the 2nd floor, opening the door to reveal a space larger than the entire apartment she had shared with her mother and stepfather. A queen bed dominated the room, covered in crisp white linens. An attached bathroom featured a shower with multiple heads and heated floors. He told her to get cleaned up, to rest, that they would talk in the morning. He placed the cash from her stepfather, her cash now, he clarified, on the dresser. Then he left, closing the door quietly behind him. Sophia stood in the center of the room for a long moment, unable to process the sudden shift from nightmare to something that felt almost like a dream. Eventually, muscle memory took over. She showered, washing away the filth of the rusty chain and the terror of the evening. She put on clean clothes, and then she lay down on the bed, expecting to stare at the ceiling for hours. She was asleep in minutes, her exhausted body claiming the rest it desperately needed. Outside her room, Adrian sat in his study with a glass of whiskey, making phone calls to ensure that what remained of the Desert Snakes understood their new reality. The gang would disband or face complete annihilation. The rusty chain would be purchased through shell companies and converted into a legitimate business. And Sophia's stepfather would receive one final visit, not from Adrian personally, but from associates who would make certain he understood that crossing paths with the girl again would result in consequences that made tonight's beating seem gentle by comparison. Building trust, the first weeks in Adrian's home passed in a strange limbo. Sophia moved through the days like a ghost, still half convinced she would wake up back in her old life, that this reprieve was temporary and fragile. Adrian maintained a polite distance, making sure she had everything she needed, but never pressing her to talk or explain or engage beyond the bare minimum. He hired a woman named Carmen, a grandmother in her 60s, with kind eyes and gentle hands, to stay at the house during the day, providing companionship and helping Sophia adjust. Carmen cooked meals that made Sophia's eyes water, not from tears, but from the overwhelming realization that food could taste like this, that she could eat until she was full without worrying about when the next meal would come. She helped Sophia shop for new clothes, for shoes that fit properly, for small luxuries like lotion and shampoo that didn't come from dollar stores. She asked questions but never pried, offered advice but never pushed, created space for Sophia to begin healing from wounds both physical and psychological. Adrian himself remained an enigma. Sophia learned that he left early most mornings and returned late most evenings, that he spoke several languages fluently, that he read extensively from a library that filled an entire wall of his study. She learned that he never raised his voice, that he treated Carmen with unfailing courtesy, that he possessed a dark sense of humor that occasionally surfaced in dry observations about the absurdity of human nature. But his actual business, the source of his wealth and power, remained unspoken, a tacit agreement that some questions were better left unasked. Slowly, tentatively, Sophia began to emerge from her shell. She started reading books from Adrian's library, discovering worlds of philosophy and history and literature she had never known existed. She began helping Carmen with cooking, learning techniques and recipes that transformed ingredients into meals that felt like small celebrations. She started exercising, rebuilding strength in a body that had been weakened by months of inadequate nutrition and constant stress. One evening, about 6 weeks after her rescue, Sophia found Adrian in his study reviewing documents. She knocked softly on the doorframe, and he looked up with an expression that invited her to speak. She asked the question that had been building inside her since that first night. Why had he helped her? He could have ignored her plea, could have walked away, could have let the night unfold without intervention. Why had a Mafia boss, a man of violence and power, chosen to save a nobody girl from nowhere? Adrian was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he considered his answer. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. He told her that power without purpose was just cruelty, that strength that exploited the weak was no strength at all. He told her that his empire was built on violence, yes, but also on codes and rules that separated him from animals like the bikers at the Rusty Chain. He told her that every man chose what kind of monster to be, and he had decided long ago that he would never be the kind that preyed on children. New purpose. As months passed, Sophia's role in the household evolved organically. She wasn't a prisoner, nor was she adopted family. She existed in an undefined space that suited them both. She finished her high school education through online courses, discovering a talent for mathematics and languages that surprised her. Adrian encouraged her studies, occasionally helping with difficult concepts, revealing depths of knowledge that belied any assumption that violence was his only skill. She also began to understand, through careful observation and overheard conversations, the true scope of Adrian's operations. He controlled territory throughout Nevada and parts of California, overseeing businesses both legal and otherwise. He commanded loyalty through a combination of fair dealing with allies and merciless punishment of enemies. He existed in a world where handshake agreements carried more weight than legal contracts, where reputation was currency and weakness invited predation. This knowledge should have frightened her, but instead Sophia found it oddly comforting. Adrian's world had clear rules, transparent consequences, and a kind of brutal honesty that contrasted sharply with the supposed legitimacy that had allowed her stepfather to abuse her without intervention. The system that should have protected her, social services, schools, law enforcement, had failed completely. But this criminal, this man who lived outside that system, had saved her when no one else would. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, a scene that had become almost domestic in its familiarity, Sophia made a decision. She told Adrian that she wanted to be useful, to contribute, to learn the skills that would ensure she never felt helpless again. She expected him to refuse, to insist she focus on normal teenage concerns like college preparation and social activities. Instead, he studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Her education began in earnest. Carmen taught her practical skills, cooking, budgeting, negotiation, the subtle art of reading people and situations. Adrian taught her self-defense, not the flashy martial arts of movies, but brutal, efficient techniques designed for survival. He taught her to shoot, to maintain weapons, to understand security systems and how to circumvent them. He taught her about business, both legitimate and otherwise, about supply chains and logistics and the economic principles that governed all human exchange. Tested Sophia was 18 when everything nearly fell apart. A rival organization, the Bratva, Russian mob with ambitions of expanding into Adrian's territory, made their move. It started with small provocations. Shipments delayed, businesses vandalized, low-level soldiers disappearing. Adrian responded with measured escalation, making it clear that further aggression would be met with overwhelming force. For a time, the situation seemed stable, contained. Then they came for Adrian directly. The attack happened at a restaurant in downtown Las Vegas, a neutral meeting place where Adrian was supposed to negotiate territorial boundaries with a different organization entirely. The Bratva had somehow infiltrated the venue, planting gunmen among the staff. When the shooting started, Adrian's bodyguards reacted instantly, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Sophia was at home when she received the call, not from Adrian, who was fighting for his life, but from Marcus, his second-in-command. The words felt unreal. Adrian was injured, pinned down, possibly dying. Backup was coming, but might arrive too late. Sophia's blood ran cold, then hot, then settled into something crystalline and clear. She grabbed keys, weapons, the training that had been drilled into her over years. She reached the restaurant in record time, parking 2 blocks away and approaching on foot. The sound of gunfire had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence punctuated by distant sirens. Sophia slipped through the kitchen entrance, moving with the stealth Adrian had taught her, her heart pounding but her hands steady. Bodies littered the dining room. Adrian's men, Bratva soldiers, innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. She found Adrian behind an overturned table, his shirt soaked with blood from a wound in his shoulder. 2 of his guards lay nearby, one clearly dead, the other breathing shallowly. 3 Bratva gunmen were advancing cautiously, weapons raised, thinking they had cornered wounded prey. They didn't hear Sophia until it was too late. The training kicked in with muscle memory precision. Sophia dropped the first gunman with 2 shots, center mass, just as she'd been taught. The second spun toward her, and she dove behind a pillar, rounds chewing into the wood above her head. She returned fire, her own bullets finding flesh. The third gunman rushed her position, and she met him with the combat knife Adrian had given her for her 17th birthday. The one she had promised never to use unless absolutely necessary. When it was over, when the Bratva soldiers lay dead or dying and sirens wailed closer in the night, Sophia knelt beside Adrian. His face was pale, his breathing labored, but his eyes were clear. He looked at her with something approaching pride, or perhaps recognition, the acknowledgement that she had become exactly what she'd asked to be, capable, strong, unbreakable. Aftermath and evolution. The aftermath of the restaurant attack reshaped power dynamics throughout the West Coast underworld. The Bratva retreated, their leadership decimated, and their expansion plans abandoned. Adrian's organization emerged stronger, having weathered a direct assault and responded with such overwhelming force that potential rivals reconsidered their ambitions. And Sophia, no longer the terrified girl from the Rusty Chain parking lot, became known in certain circles as someone not to be underestimated. Adrian recovered fully, though he carried a new scar that matched several others already decorating his body. His relationship with Sophia evolved into something harder to define than guardian and ward. She was family, certainly, but also trusted lieutenant, capable of handling delicate operations that required intelligence and judgment rather than pure violence. She managed legitimate businesses that laundered money through complex corporate structures. She negotiated with suppliers and distributors. She proved herself repeatedly in situations that would have broken lesser people. Years passed, marked not by traditional milestones, but by the acquisition of skills, territory, and respect. Sophia celebrated her 21st birthday not with a typical party, but by successfully negotiating a truce between two feuding organizations that had threatened to drag Adrian's operations into unnecessary conflict. She earned a degree in business administration, which amused Adrian greatly. The irony of legitimate education supporting illegitimate enterprise was not lost on either of them. She dated occasionally, though finding someone who could accept her life proved challenging. Most men were either intimidated by her competence or attracted to the danger in ways that felt exploitative. She had learned from Adrian that solitude was preferable to companionship with the wrong person, that loneliness was less corrosive than constant compromise of essential truths. In a full circle, on a cold October night, 5 years after the restaurant attack, Sophia found herself back in Nevada's empty desert. Not at the Rusty Chain. Adrian had indeed bought that property and converted it into a youth shelter, complete with counselors and security and resources for kids with nowhere else to go. No, this was a different kind of pilgrimage. She had come to scatter her mother's ashes, something she had been unable to do when fresh grief had made everything impossible. She stood alone beneath a sky so clear that stars blazed like diamonds scattered across black velvet. The wind carried the scent of sage and dust, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to the moon. Sophia opened the urn and released her mother's remains to the desert, watching them drift and disperse, becoming part of the landscape that had witnessed both the worst and best moments of her life. She thought about the girl she had been, broken, terrified, convinced that the world held nothing for her but pain and exploitation. She thought about the woman she had become, strong, capable, existing outside society's normal boundaries, but according to her own strict code. She thought about Adrian, who had taught her that monsters could choose their form, that power without honor was meaningless, that protecting the vulnerable was the only nobility that mattered. Her phone buzzed with a text from Adrian. A new situation required her attention, details to follow. Sophia smiled slightly, pocketed the phone, and took one last look at the desert stars. Then she walked back to her car, a practical sedan that drew no attention, unlike the flashy vehicles favored by those who confused wealth with status, and drove toward Las Vegas's distant glow. The highway stretched before her exactly as it had that terrible night years ago, but everything had changed. The scared girl was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the world was neither fair nor kind, but could be navigated successfully by those strong enough to impose their own rules. She had learned from the devil himself, and the education had been worth every dark lesson. The truth revealed. What Sophia didn't know, what she wouldn't discover for another 3 years, was that her rescue hadn't been quite the random chance she believed. Adrian Luciani had been at the Rusty Chain that night for a very specific reason. He'd been tracking the Desert Snake's human trafficking operation for months, building a case not for law enforcement, which he trusted about as far as he could throw a mountain, but for his own purposes. He had planned to dismantle the gang systematically, to eliminate them piece by piece, until nothing remained. Her stepfather's appearance with Sophia had simply accelerated the timeline. Adrian had recognized immediately what was happening, and something in Sophia's eyes, that mixture of terror and determination, the refusal to surrender even when surrender seemed inevitable, had resonated with something in his own past. He too had once been helpless, once been at the mercy of cruel men with no regard for human dignity. His intervention had been strategic, yes, but also deeply personal. He had watched her over the years, noting how she absorbed lessons, how she transformed trauma into strength, rather than letting it metastasize into bitterness or cruelty. He had tested her repeatedly, placing her in situations designed to reveal character, and she had passed every test not through ruthlessness, but through intelligent application of force tempered by principle. She had become exactly what he had hoped, someone who could carry forward his particular brand of justice when he was gone. Because Adrian Luciani, though he showed no outward signs, was dying. A diagnosis received shortly before that fateful night at the Rusty Chain had given him 5 years, maybe 10 if he was lucky. He had chosen not to fight it, not to pursue aggressive treatments that would weaken him and make him vulnerable in a world where weakness was blood in the water. Instead, he had chosen to find and train a successor, someone who understood that their empire needed to be more than just criminal enterprise, that it could be a force for protecting those whom legitimate systems failed. Sophia discovered the truth by accident, finding medical records in Adrian's study during a search for different documents entirely. The shock nearly broke her. This man who had saved her, shaped her, become the closest thing to family she had ever known, had been on borrowed time from the beginning. When she confronted him, he didn't deny it, didn't offer false comfort or empty reassurances. He simply told her that death came for everyone eventually, and what mattered was how you spent the time you had. Legacy Adrian Luciani died on a spring morning 2 years after Sophia's discovery, peacefully in his sleep, a gentle exit that seemed almost unfair for a man who had lived such a violent life. His empire passed to Sophia, not through formal written will, too traceable, too vulnerable to legal challenge, but through established relationships and demonstrated capability. Some of his lieutenants objected initially, seeing her as too young, too soft, too female. They learned quickly that they were wrong on all counts. Sophia ran the organization differently than Adrian had, with modifications that reflected changing times and her own particular skills. She expanded legitimate operations, using them not just as money-laundering vehicles, but as genuine profit centers that provided jobs and stability to communities. She maintained Adrian's absolute stance against human trafficking, going so far as to assist law enforcement anonymously in bringing down other organizations that engaged in such practices. She proved to be a more sophisticated negotiator than Adrian, able to resolve conflicts without resorting to immediate violence, though when violence became necessary, she proved equally capable. The youth shelter that had replaced the Rusty Chain became her particular passion. She expanded it, funded similar operations in other cities, created pathways for kids in situations like her own to find safety and opportunity. Some of those kids eventually joined her organization, drawn by loyalty and gratitude. Others went on to normal lives, college, careers, families, carrying forward the lesson that rescue and redemption were possible even in the darkest circumstances. On quiet nights, Sophia sometimes drove out to the desert, to the place where she had scattered her mother's ashes and confronted the truth of her own transformation. She would sit on the hood of her car and watch stars wheel overhead, thinking about the strange path her life had taken. She had been saved by a monster shaped by violence, forged in circumstances that should have destroyed her. And yet she had become someone who protected rather than preyed, who built rather than destroyed, who understood that power was only meaningful when exercised with purpose. The surprise. 10 years after Adrian's death, Sophia received an unexpected visitor at her office in Las Vegas. The woman who walked in was elderly now, probably in her 70s, with silver hair and eyes that held both sadness and strength. She introduced herself as Elena Luciani, Adrian's mother, a woman Sophia had never known existed. Adrian had spoken so rarely of his past, had seemed to emerge fully formed from nothing, that the idea of him having family felt almost surreal. Elena carried with her a box, worn leather and secured with a simple lock. She explained that Adrian had left explicit instructions. If he died, and Sophia survived to assume control of his operations, this box was to be delivered to her on the 10th anniversary of his death. Inside, Elena said, were letters, dozens of them, written over the years, explaining things Adrian had never been able to say aloud. Sophia opened the box with trembling hands, finding stacks of envelopes arranged chronologically. She started reading, and the words unmade her. Adrian detailed his own childhood, the abuse and exploitation he had endured, his escape and transformation into someone strong enough to ensure others wouldn't suffer as he had. He wrote about his diagnosis, about his decision to find and train a successor, about recognizing something of himself in Sophia's desperate courage that night at the Rusty Chain. But the final letter, written just days before his death, contained the surprise that changed everything. Adrian revealed that he had established trusts in Sophia's name, legitimate investments and holdings worth hundreds of millions. Enough to walk away from the criminal enterprise entirely if she chose, to build a completely legal life without looking back. He had done this, he explained, because her choice needed to be real. She needed to stay in the life, not because she was trapped, but because she genuinely believed in the mission of protecting those whom no one else would protect. He wrote that he was proud of her, that she had become more than he had ever hoped, that she carried forward his legacy not through imitation, but through her own unique wisdom and strength. He wrote that the girl who had whispered for help in a parking lot had grown into a woman who answered such whispers from others. He wrote that she was the daughter he had never had, and that saving her had been the most meaningful thing he had done in a life defined by violence and power. Decision. Sophia sat in her office long after Elena had departed. The letters spread before her, tears streaming silently down her face. She thought about the choice Adrian had given her, the freedom to walk away, to become legitimate, to live without constantly looking over her shoulder or making decisions that existed in moral grey areas. The money was real, the trusts verified by lawyers who owed loyalty to no criminal organization. She could leave tomorrow and never look back. But as she sat there, she thought about the kids in her shelters, about the women escaping abuse who found protection through her networks, about the addicts getting clean in rehab centers she funded, about the families living in housing her organizations maintained. She thought about all the people who existed in society's margins, who the legitimate systems failed or ignored, who needed someone powerful enough to push back against predators and cruel circumstance. She thought about the dozens of Sophia Martinezes who existed right now, trapped in situations just as desperate as hers had been, waiting for someone to hear their whispered pleas for help. She thought about how rare it was for someone with power to use it in service of something beyond their own enrichment or ego. She thought about Adrian's lesson, that monsters chose their form, and she could choose to be the kind of monster that frightened other monsters. The decision, when she made it, felt inevitable. She would stay, not because she was trapped, but because she was needed. The legitimate investments would grow, creating more resources for helping more people. The criminal empire would continue, but always with the understanding that its purpose transcended mere profit. And someday, when she was ready, she would find her own successor, someone broken and desperate and brave enough to be forged into something stronger. Epilogue. 20 years after that night at the Rusty Chain, Sophia Martins, she had taken Adrian's birth name as her surname, a private tribute, stood in a new youth shelter on the outskirts of Reno. She was 46 now, still strong, but carrying the weight of 2 decades in a life that aged people faster than normal existence. She watched kids file in for dinner, saw herself in their wary expressions, recognized the particular tension of bodies prepared for violence, even in moments of apparent safety. One girl in particular caught her attention. 14, maybe 15, with bruises carefully hidden under long sleeves and a manner that suggested recent trauma. The girl sat alone, pushing food around her plate without eating, her eyes constantly scanning for threats. Sophia felt time collapse, felt herself simultaneously in this moment and back in that parking lot, desperate and terrified, and clutching at hope she didn't really believe existed. She walked over and sat across from the girl, said nothing at first, just shared the space. Eventually, the girl looked up and their eyes met. Sophia saw the question forming, the fear and desperate hope warring in young features. Before the girl could speak, Sophia leaned forward slightly and said something that Adrian had once said to her. That everyone got to choose what kind of person they became, that trauma could be transformed into strength, that the world was neither fair nor kind, but could be navigated successfully by those brave enough to impose their own rules. The girl listened with an intensity that suggested she understood these weren't empty platitudes, but hard-won wisdom from someone who had walked similar paths. When Sophia finished speaking, the girl asked a single question. Was it possible to stop feeling afraid? Sophia smiled slightly and gave the only honest answer she could, that fear never completely disappeared, but it could be transmuted into awareness, into preparedness, into the fuel that powered vigilance and strength. She told the girl that she herself had once been saved by someone who saw potential, where everyone else saw just another broken child. She told her that paying forward such rescue was the most meaningful thing anyone could do with their life. She told her that if she wanted it, if she was brave enough and determined enough and willing to work harder than she had ever worked before, there was a path forward that led to strength and purpose, and the power to help others find their own paths. The girl considered this, chewing her lip, studying Sophia's face for signs of deception or false promise. Finally, she nodded slowly, and in that moment, Sophia saw the beginning of another transformation. She thought about the long chain of rescue and training, extending backward through Adrian to herself, to this girl, to who knew how many others in the future. She thought about how one night of intervention could ripple forward through decades, saving not just individuals, but creating networks of protection and opportunity. As Sophia left the shelter that evening, driving through Reno's neon-lit streets toward her next meeting, she reflected on the strange architecture of her life. She existed outside society's normal boundaries, operating in spaces where law gave way to older codes of conduct. She had done things she wasn't proud of, made choices that had cost lives and inflicted suffering. But she had also saved dozens, maybe hundreds, had created systems that protected the vulnerable, had become the answer to whispered pleas for help. The night was cold and clear, stars visible even through the city's light pollution. Sophia thought about Adrian, about her mother, about all the people who had shaped her into who she had become. She thought about the girl she had been and the woman she was now, about the distance between those 2 points and the blood and tears and determination that had bridged it. She thought about monsters and angels and the recognition that most people existed somewhere between those extremes, making choices that defined them day by day. The story comes full circle, reminding us that rescue isn't a single moment, but a continuous choice, to use whatever power we have in service of something beyond ourselves, to transform our own pain into protection for others, to remember that even in darkness, someone might be listening for a whispered plea for help, and perhaps that's the most important truth. That in a world often characterized by indifference and cruelty, the decision to act with honor and protect the vulnerable is what separates mere power from genuine strength. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in the power of one person choosing to make a difference, please subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like this, tales of transformation, resilience, and the unexpected places where hope can be found. Together, we explore the complex territories of human nature, the gray spaces between right and wrong, and the profound impact of choosing compassion even in the harshest circumstances. Thank you for listening.